Okay, so the embroidery that we're going to work on now is the long ornament. And so the long ornament is not an applique, it's all finished with thread. So we're going to have some fills, we're going to have some solid fills, and we'll have some quilting on the outside. So the first thing that we know, if I look at the instructions, this box is going to be trimmed to 4 by 10.5. And so this we're going to be drawing freehand. So what I want to do is I want to create a box 4 by 10.5 so that when I'm building this, I make sure that I keep everything within those parameters. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my IQ Designer. So I'm going to go to IQ Designer. I want to create a rectangular box which is 4 by 10.5. So I'm going to go to my shape creator, which is the circle and the square right here. I'm going to choose, so by default, the first set of closed shapes is what appears. So I'm going to choose the square, and the reason why I'm choosing this one instead of a rectangle is this rectangle has rounded corners. I want square corners. So I'm going to choose my square and touch OK. When it comes in on my screen, it has a red box around it. So it's actually a black square with the red box. I want to make this 4 by 10.5 just so that I have something to work with. So while the red box is around anything, I can size it. So right now, I can go to size, and I can make this box any way, any shape, any width, any height. So right now, the square comes in at 6.19 by 6.19. I want it to be 4 inches across and 10.5 inches high. So to stretch this, because I'm only at 6 inches, I'm going to go to my 2 arrows that stretch, and I'm going to stretch it until I get to 10.5 inches. So I'm going to keep, I went too far, so I'm going to bring it back down till I'm at 10.5 on the top. Now, if your machine is still in millimeters, when you purchase your machine and it comes out of the box, it's in millimeters. So if you go to your settings page up here, and I scroll through, and depending on which machine you're on, you're going to have to look for it, but you're going to see where it says unit of measure, and your choices are inch or millimeter. If yours is highlighted to millimeter, I need you to switch it to inches, and you're going to click OK at the bottom, and everything will appear in inches. So now I've got my 10.5, my height. It's 6.25, almost 6.25. I want to shrink it this way, widthwise. So I'm going to use the arrows that go in, and I'm going to press and hold until I get that to 4 inches. Remember, I'm setting this up because I want to have a perimeter to work within. Oops. You can see when you press and hold, it goes fast. And if you're on any machine, and if it's 4.01, it's okay. Now, if you don't have a mouse for your machine, I highly recommend that you get a mouse, and it plugs into your second USB port on the side of your machine. And a mouse is a lot easier to work with, especially on the Solaris. If you're on a Destiny, a Meridian, or a Pathfinder, you're going to find that your hard stylus works just fine. Okay, I also want to have a grid in here. And I'm going to use the grid because the grid helps me see how much space I have to work with. So again, I'm going to go into my settings, and when your frame sizes come up, and so it may be page 8 of 12, it may be a different page, you have something that says grid, and when we touch it, we can have an inch grid or a 3/8 inch grid. I'm going to touch my inch grid, and now I have a grid on my screen. Okay, now we're going to free draw in here. So what happens is when I want to put the hanger, so I'm going to show you the hanger again. When I add this hanger, this is about 1 inch tall, and I probably have another inch here. So I've got about 2 inches here, and I don't want my ornament to come clear to the bottom, and I don't want my ornament to go clear to the top. So if this is 10.5 inches wide, I want to keep this part of it somewhere around 7-8 inches. So now we're going to draw, and this is to show you how to draw freehand on your screen. So I am going to touch, remember, this is my line properties. Line right here. Everything in this box is line properties. This solid square is my fill properties. So I'm going to go to my line properties and I want to touch my pencil. Now, if I go to my line properties, this pencil here is just drawing freehand. This one, when I draw, it's always going to close my shape. This one is always going to make a straight line, and this one is going to be like doing dot to dot. So if I touch on my screen and I do a dot and another dot, it's going to put a line between it, and another dot and another dot. We just want to free flow our pencil. So I'm going to touch this, and I'm going to choose red as my color, just so that you can see what my stitch looks like. So I'm going to come over here. And again, these are inch squares, so I want to leave about 2 inches here, and I've got my 1/4 inch at the top. So I want to start right about here, and I just want a narrow tube, so I'm just going to come down and come out and go back. Okay? Doesn't have to be perfect. We're not all artists. We're just creating something that's going to have a narrow tube at the top and an open bulb at the bottom. If you don't like it, hit undo and you can retry it. So I'm just going to come down, and remember, nobody knows what your ornament is supposed to look like. Okay, so I want to get it so it's close to this bottom line down here. When I say that, I want it to be close to the center line as well. Okay, so now I have my line there. I don't want to try to create another line on this side that matches this one perfectly. So what I'm going to do is I want to isolate this line, and I want to mirror image it. So to isolate anything, down here is your select box. So if you notice right now, all of these buttons are grayed out. But when I touch my select box and I touch something that I want to select, and I select it, now these keys have come to life. Okay? If I am on a Destiny, a Pathfinder, or a Meridian, my select button is going to be here. And I am just going to grab a square and put it around here. Now, I'm going to go in and show Meridians, Pathfinders, and Destinies. You do not have a mirror image key. I'm going to show this for the Solaris, and then I'll go and show you a shape that you can use. So I am going to mirror image that shape. Okay, so now that I have 1/2 of this, I need to make the other half. And instead of trying to just figure out how this line was drawn exactly, I'm going to hit my duplicate. So I've duplicated it. You can see that I now have 2. And I'm going to mirror image it. Now remember, the first box, the first line no longer has a box around it. The one that has the box around it is the one that I'm now accessing. So when I hit the mirror image, it flips the second one, and I can line it up over here. Now I can go to my size, my rotate, so I'm going to touch size, and it gives me these arrows, so I can use these arrows to nudge this in so that it's touching the other one. I can also zoom in. So if I zoom in, let's say to 800%, and I use my little hand up here, I highlight my hand and I scroll down, I want to make sure that these two are overlapping. Now you can see I don't have this lined up perfectly. So I'm going to access my size key, and I'm going to move this up because I want to line those two up so that they're touching. And I'm actually going to overlap them so that they make a point at the bottom. Okay, and I'm going to zoom back out so that you can see that. So here is my ornament, okay? And now what I want to do is I want to cut off the top of this. If I click off the red box goes away, and now I can't do anything. If you see I'm trying to move this, I can't move anything because I don't have a red box around it. Okay? So now I want to cut this off and make a perfectly straight line across there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my line properties. This time I'm going to grab a straight line. I'm still going to use my red here. And if I take my arrow and just go straight across there, it creates a straight line. And now I have this ornament that is quite beautiful. So now what I want to do is zoom in, and I want to erase the parts of my line that I don't need. So I'm going to zoom in, and again I'm going to scroll up here, and what I want to do is get rid of this, everything that's outside of my box. So to do that, I'm going to touch my eraser. I like to work with a square eraser, so I'm going to touch the square, but remember I'm zoomed in. So if I touch here and go down, can you see how large my eraser is? So you just don't want to stick your eraser here and plop it on because you're going to erase something. But I always have my undo, so I'm going to undo. I'm going to take my eraser, and I like to just kind of nudge it down right to the line. And always like click, erase, click, erase. Don't try to erase large areas, because if I'm coming over here and I do this one perfectly and I don't let go or don't lift my stylus and then I go over here, when I hit undo, I bring everything back. So it's a whole lot easier just to undo small parts. So I'm going to undo this, just sneak up on it. Oops, too much, so hit undo. I'm going to sneak up on it, undo that part. And it just takes a fine hand, and I'm not sitting real close to my screen in this video. And I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to erase this. And again, I just erase small amounts at a time. Okay, and then I can use my hand to scroll over. You can see I have to erase all of this. Okay, and I can scroll over here and erase all of this. And again, just keep letting go of your stylus or your cursor so that if you make a mistake, you don't have to go back and redo everything. Okay, so that looks pretty good there. And then I'm going to move this up, and I want to look at the tip. And down here, I'm going to take my eraser. So I'm going to highlight my eraser again. And I'm just going to go here. Oops, too much. So you see, you just got to work at it kind of slow. And that looks good. And when I zoom out, as long as it looks like a nice smooth flow. Now when I zoomed out, I see that there's part here that I didn't erase. So I'm going to grab my eraser again, and I can go in. Now when I'm zoomed out, my eraser is really small, but you want to make sure that you get rid of all those lines, because any line that's not taken away is going to be a satin stitch. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And once I have my shape, it's always better to save. So I'm going to save it in memory. So I'm going to touch down here, memory, and I'm going to save it to my USB because I'm using the Shops machine, but you're probably going to save it to your sewing machine. So I'm just going to save it, and there it is. Now remember, we're working in IQ. It does not save it as a sewing file, an embroidery file, a PES file. It's saving it as a artwork file. Okay, so I'm going to leave this here for just a minute, but I want to show you, if you have a Meridian or a Pathfinder or a Destiny, or you're just like, I don't like drawing this, I don't want to do it, I'm going to show you a different shape that you can use. Okay, so if you're on a machine that doesn't have mirror image, it's really hard to take that side that we did on the right and duplicate it perfectly. And then some of you are going to say, I don't even like drawing on here and I don't want to do it. And that's okay. So another shape that you could use is you could come over to your shapes, and you could turn any one of these shapes into your ornament. But I especially like either this one or this one, So I'm going to choose the teardrop and I'm going to say okay. And it comes in a red box. Now you can still see my black box that is outside of here, but I'm going to take, while the red box is around it, I'm going to touch my size key. I'm going to narrow the width so that it fits inside of my black box. I'm going to move it down towards the bottom, and I like to use the center key so that it stays perfectly center, and then use the down arrow to bring it down, oh, probably like right about there. And then I can stretch it, and I'm going to stretch it up to about there. So this is another quick way that you could create. And now you can see it's stretched outside of here, so I'm going to bring it up. I got to keep it inside that black box. Okay, and now I'm getting a little tall here. So I'm going to take my grid off right now, because if I take the grid off, you're going to be able to see it better. So I'm going to switch mine to no grid, and you can absolutely do that. But you can see I need to have a little bit more room up here, so I'm going to move this down. Okay. And I still need to add a hanger up here, so I need about an inch here, and I need some top here. So that looks pretty good. When in doubt, make it smaller. So let's just make it a tiny bit smaller and move it down. Okay, so this is the other shape that I could work with. Okay, so I will continue with this shape, but you can use the other shape that you had. When I touch off, this is kind of what my ornament is going to look like, okay? So we've got our ornament part. We know that it fits in the 4 by 10.5 inch block that we're going to work in, our finished size, okay? So the next thing that we want to do is we want to add a topper on this. So the topper is this little guy right here. All right, so just like on the one that we drew freehand, I want to cut a top off of here. So I'm going to go to my line properties. I'm going to select the straight line. I'm going to touch OK, and I want to cut off the top of this. So if I just move my stylus or my cursor and go straight across, I've now created a flat part there. Again, I don't want this part, so I'm going to take my eraser. I like to use the square. I'm going to zoom in. Okay. Now on a Solaris, you have this hand that allows you to pan. On your Destiny, your Meridian, or your Pathfinder, you're going to have a box up here that has a red square in it. And if you take the red square and move it around, it moves you within here. That's how you're going to get around on your machine. And again, I'm going to touch my eraser, and I'm going to go over here. I like to use the square eraser. I'm going to zoom in more. Okay, I am on a Solaris, so I'm going to use my hand to pan in. Again, on the other machines, you're going to use the red box to move around in here. And I'm going to take my square, and I'm going to erase the parts here that I don't need. And I keep scrolling to my hand to move it over, and I scroll back to my eraser. And I want everything to be nice and tidy, so I'm going to zoom in even more. In Solaris's, you can zoom to 1600%. But remember, the more you zoom in, the bigger your eraser is. See how large my eraser is now? So I'm going to make my eraser smaller when I zoom in. So I'm going to just take this over here, grab that. I'm going to grab my eraser again. And I like to just let go one time before I get that last one. And I'm going to zoom over here and touch my eraser. And I'm going to come down like this. And I'm going to take my eraser over here and come over like this. And when I'm finished, I'm going to zoom out and I'm going to save in memory. So you're going to save in memory. And if you're on a Meridian, Pathfinder, or Altair, you've got a red arrow going into the pocket. You want to save it into your pocket. If you're on a Solaris, you're going to save it here. Okay, so now I have my basic shape. So you either got this shape or the previous shape that we did. And now what we want to do is we want to add a topper on top of this. So I'm going to go to my shapes, and this time I'm going to grab this little shape down here. And it's a lot of fun to look at these shapes and try to figure out different ways that you can use these shapes. So I'm going to touch the shape, and I'm going to touch OK. Now you can see that this shape comes in really large, but the red box is around it. So while the red box is around it, the size button is active. So I'm going to touch the size button, and I'm going to start shrinking that. I'm going to use the 4 arrows that go in to shrink it proportionately. And as I shrink it, I'm going to keep moving it up here because I want it to look like it's setting on top of this. So let me show you. I'm shrinking it, and you can have your topper as large or as small as you want it, okay? So this fits here, but I'm going to shrink it a little bit this way. Okay, and I'm going to make it, and it's all, you're the designer. It's your ornament. You can make it look however you want to make it look. Now, if I click off of here, it's no longer highlighted in red, so now I can't move it, I can't size it, I can't do anything to it. I need to touch my undo to bring that red box back around it. And I still want to make that shorter because I need to have room for my hanger at the top. So I'm going to go back to my size, and I'm going to shrink it even more. Okay, and everyone's going to look different, and that's okay. And if I click off the box, I can see what it looks like. And if I zoom in, I can see what it looks like. So let me zoom out so I can find it. Okay, now if I hit my undo button, it brings the red box back around it. And I'm going to, in my zoomed in position, I'm going to make it a little bit tighter so that it just touches the edges out here. And if I touch off, you have to unhighlight your pan hand. It takes away the red. Okay, so I'm going to go with this as my topper, but now I need to get rid of this part because that is going to be stitches. So I'm going to go in and grab my eraser, and I've got to make my eraser really small because I'm zoomed in. Look how big my eraser is. And I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to try to erase this as best I can. Now, sometimes it's really hard to get in these places, but this is going to be a solid stitch, so I'm not so worried about it. Okay, I'm going to go even smaller, and I'm going to zoom in more. And again, I want to make it small, and I'm going to go in and try to get rid of this. And you can be as picky as you want to be, and I always feel kind of challenged to be just as picky as I can be and get it perfect. Okay, so that side looks excellent. I'm going to move over to this side, and I'm going to try to make this side just as nice. And again, erase and let go. Erase and let go. Oops, and I clipped there. So I'm just going to hit undo, and I'm going to keep going in to try to get rid of those lines. Okay, and I'm just going to be good with that. I could try to go down one more, but it may not work. Okay, we're good. And I'm going to zoom back out. Okay, and I'm going to save again. I like saving more than not saving. So I'm going to save. Now, the next thing that I want to do is add a topper up here, the little hanger. So we're going to go to our shapes one more time. This time we're going to go to our pennants. We're going to go to our swirls, sorry, and we're going to go to the second row, the last column, grab the same one that we've been using, it comes in really large. So what we want to do is the red box is around it, so we're only working with this item here. We are going to rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise. Remember, when we rotate counterclockwise, it counts back from 360. I'm going to move it up here, and we want to shrink that. So I'm going to go to my size, and I am going to shrink it. Now, normally, when I do my up and down, it shrinks it this way, but remember, we've rotated it. So just play with these. Once you rotate it, you've just got to be aware of which way, in which direction these are shrinking it. So I'm going to shrink it this way, and I'm going to shrink it, oops, I want to shrink it this, narrow it. And again, it's all matter of preference. And I'm going to use this. Now, if you want to keep it on the same vertical line, put it in the center and use these arrows to bring it up. And we want to make sure that it's close, but that it's not touching this. We don't like things touching because remember, this line and this line will have to be the same stitch. So I'm going to zoom in, and I just want to make sure that it's close. Okay, so I can move that down farther. So I'm going to hit size or rotate and use my arrows to bring it down. Now when I zoom back out, you can see it's not touching. When I zoom back out, it looks like it is touching, and that's good. Okay? So right now we have our bulb, we have the top of the bulb, and we have our hanger. So the next thing we want to do is we want to put a flower inside of here. So we're going to go to our shapes one more time. Okay, and we are going to grab this flower right here and touch OK. And again, it comes in really large. The red button is around it. We're going to touch size, and we're going to shrink that. This shrinks it proportionately. And depending on if you're using this shape or your own created shape, we just want it to fit somewhere at the top. And again, I could use the center button to put it on the vertical axis and use these arrows to move it up. And then I want to add some leaves. So I'm going to go to my shape creator again. I'm going to go to my spiral. I'm going to grab this set of leaves right here, touch OK. Okay. Now I want to rotate these. Again, they came in really large. I'm going to rotate counterclockwise 90 degrees, and I need to size it. So I'm going to hit OK, touch size, and I can shape everything or size it proportionately. So I'm just going to bring it here. You can see it's still too large, right? Now normally I need to shrink it left and right. So I would normally shrink left and right this way, but remember we've rotated it. So now I need to use these to shrink it. So you can see how it's getting more and more narrow. And when I click off of here and take my box away, I just want to make sure I don't want this stem touching because I want a different line property here than I want here. But I want to make sure that my leaves aren't touching the glass on the outside. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And I'm happy with that. So I'm going to leave this. And right now, if I show you our design, we have created something like this. And again, nobody knows that your ornament was supposed to be narrow and go up this way. I just used a built-in shape and created a very similar ornament. Okay, and so the last thing that we want to do is we want to add a fill. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to go to our fill properties. So remember, this is line properties, or this piece of paper's line properties. This is fill, and this is fill properties, okay? So let's save one more time before we add the fill. So I'm going to hit memory, and I'm going to save it one more time. I want to save it on my stick. Okay, and now I'm going to go to my fill properties. Again, this is a solid fill. This is your stipple fill. And this is all your other fills. So I'm going to touch all my other fills. I'm going to go to my select. And on the Solaris, we have just a ton of fills. We have a total of 42 fills that we can use. Okay, if you're on a Destiny 1, you have 10. If you're on a Destiny 2, you have 15, and on up from there. So we're going to choose, I like to use the circles. So you can choose any fill you want, but I'm going to grab the circles and touch OK. Excuse me. And I'm going to grab a color and touch OK. Now, by default, your fill has the paintbrush highlighted. If I were to use the paintbrush, I would be painting those circles on. I don't want to paint the circles on. So I'm going to hit undo, undo, undo. I want to choose the paint can, and I want to pour the circles into my ornament. So I'm going to touch, I want to fill outside of here. So I'm going to touch in this area, and you can see that it has filled the inside there. So now we have everything that we want to do, and we are going to digitize what we've just done. All right, so when we digitize stuff and we start adding all this stuff, we have to think about how it's going to stitch out. So I want everything in the bottle to stitch out first because it's inside the bottle, and I want the outline of the bottle and the topper to stitch out second. So when you start building your own designs, you've got to think about how it's going to stitch out. So I want the inside to stitch out first. So I don't want this or my top or the outline to stitch. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go, this is a line, the outside, those are all line properties. So I'm going to go into my line properties, and I'm going to choose don't sew. So I'm going to touch my no sew, and I'm going to touch OK. Now, this is where your pencil lives. It was a pencil before we changed it to a line before, and by default it's a pencil. What I want to do is I want to tell it not to sew this, not to sew the outline here, and not to sew this part here. If I touch with the pencil highlighted and I go over here and say don't sew this, it's going to just not sew that one pencil point because this is a pencil. I don't want it to just not sew one pencil point. I want it to not sew the whole thing. So I'm going to touch my paint can or my beaker, but make sure it's the top one in your line properties. And now I'm going to go over and I'm going to touch on this line, and it grays it out. If I touch on it again, you'll hear like a thunk thunk. That means it's not going to sew. And if I touch this line, because this line is connected to this line here, none of it's going to sew. And that's good. I don't want any of that line to sew. So I said, don't sew that. Okay, I want to fill this area. So I'm going to go to my fill properties, and I want that to be a solid fill. So here's my solid fill. I'm going to grab solid, and I'm going to grab gray, because I'm going to make a gray or silver. I'm going to touch OK. Right now, the paintbrush is highlighted. I want to go in and fill this area in gray, but you can see if I go and I touch it, I'm painting the color on. I'm not that good. I'm going to hit undo. I want to pour the color in. So I'm going to touch the paint can. I'm going to go inside this area that I want to make gray, and I'm going to touch it. And now that's going to be a gray solid fill. I want to make this a red solid fill. So I'm going to go into my fill properties. I'm going to grab red. I still have my solid fills highlighted. I'm going to touch OK. The paint bucket is still highlighted, so I'm going to touch inside here. And now I have a red solid fill. I want to do the insides of my leaves green. So I'm going to go to my fill properties. I'm going to choose a green. I still have solid fill highlighted. I'm going to touch OK. Paint can is still highlighted. I'm going to touch inside of my greens. Okay. Now if I get sloppy and I touch over here, do you see what it does? I need to undo that. I need to make sure that I get inside the leaf. And if it's a really tiny area, you can zoom in. So I could zoom in here and pull it up and touch inside of here. So I know that in class, a lot of times you guys are saying that you can't get in the area. Use your zoom key. Okay, so now I have this full, I have these filled. I still need to do the outside of my flower. So I'm going to zoom in so I can see that, okay? And I am going to go into the outside of my flower is a line. So I'm going to go to my line properties and I'm going to use my candle wicking stitch. Now, if I choose red, I'm not going to see it. I'm going to stitch it red. It doesn't matter, but I'm going to pick an obnoxious color that you can see. I know in class that everybody wants to pick the pretty colors and then you can't find them on your screen. So let's touch lavender. I'm going to touch lavender. Now remember, my pencil is highlighted. If I go and touch this with my pencil, I'm only making one little dot there, a candle wicking stitch. I want the whole thing to be a candle wicking stitch. So I'm going to touch my paint can and I'm going to come over with my stylus, my mouse, whatever, and I'm going to touch that black line and I've turned that whole black line purple. Now I know I'm going to stitch it red, but I can see that that has turned colors and I know I'm good. I'm going to zoom out a little bit more to 200%. So I've digitized the inside. I've chosen what I want on the outside. I've chosen the inside of my leaves, but I haven't chosen what I want this to be. So for my stem, again, that's a line. I'm going to go to my line properties. I want it to be a bean stitch. A bean stitch is 3 passes of thread, up 2, back 1, up 2, back 1. It's a beautiful outlining stitch. So I'm going to choose a blue so you can see it. Again, I'm going to make it green, but I want to be able to see it on here. My paint bucket or beaker is highlighted, and I want this whole thing, everything that's black, I want to be blue. So I'm going to go zoom in more, okay, and I want to touch right on this line. And when I touch on it, everything here is turned blue. If I move it down here and zoom the other way, the whole line is now blue. Now what happens if you guys go in and erase or you did some touching up, if you break this line and all of a sudden you see a black line here, that's because you've broken the line, and if you don't touch that line, it's going to be a satin stitch. So you need to make sure, and that's why I never choose black as one of my colors, because black is the default, and if I see black, I know it's going to be a satin stitch, and I don't want that. Okay, so now I have chosen the inside here, and I've chosen the whole inside. The only thing that I haven't done is the outside, and I'm good with that, okay? So I'm going to do this in layers. I'm going to do the whole inside, and then I'm going to come back and do the outside. And I have a reason for doing that, and I'm going to show you when we come back to part 2. So now I'm ready to start the actual digitizing. So everything that I assigned, every line, every fill, the circles, everything, you have total control over. You get to decide how long, how thick, how dense, all of that. So let's digitize. We're going to touch next, or it may say preview at the bottom of your machine. Okay, I'm going to touch next, and on a Solaris, it's going to use the blue keys while it's thinking. Okay, so this is all we're digitizing right now. Okay, do you see this big black thick line? That big black thick line is our original box that we put on. We put the box on there because we wanted to know how much room we had to work in. If I don't get rid of this black line, it is going to stitch out in my final project. So right away, I can see that I have a black line here that I didn't want. So I'm going to hit return. I forgot to tell it, don't sew this line. So I'm going to go into my line properties. I'm going to touch no sew. Okay. My beaker is highlighted and I'm going to say don't sew that line. I don't want that line. I just put it there so that I would have a place within which to work. So now when I touch next or preview, the black line is gone. Perfect. This is how I want it to look. Okay, so right here is our big picture always on a baby lock. Up here is what we're working on right now. So the first thing it's going to do is my solid fills. Okay, so when I get to my first part that I'm going to digitize, it's showing me my gray solid fill, but I have multiple solid fills and I want all my solid fills to have the exact same properties. So I am going to link those. So you're going to highlight your link key, okay? Now you've got some options here. Like I said, you get to totally decide stitch length, density, all of that. So the first thing is the angle that it comes in at. And the angle is always set at a 45-degree angle. It is on auto. We want to change it to manual. And when we change it to manual, you can change it in 15-degree increments. Here's the thing. At 45 degrees, or if your stitches are straight up and down, sideways, or at a 45 degree, if you don't hoop things properly or they're not straight up and down, you can see that your stitches aren't quite straight up and down or aren't quite horizontal or at a perfect 45 degree. So 60 is just a better degree to use because if you choose 60, your eye doesn't notice it as much. So I like to use 60 degrees, and Baby Lock also recommends using 60 degrees, so I'm changing them to 60 degrees. Okay, I'm going to touch OK. Now you can see the red boxes around all of those, so I know it changed all of them. Density, the second box down is density. So we can go anywhere between 90 and 110%, and I like to just make things dense so that the thread covers the entire area. So I'm going to increase my density to 110%. And touch OK. And you can see the red boxes. It's changing all of them at one time. The next one is push-pull compensation, and we're just going to leave that at default. That is another whole day of explaining what push-pull compensation is. And then the last thing is undersewing. So undersewing we always want to turn on. And if you have a Solaris with the second upgrade, the default is on. On all other machines it's off. What undersewing does is when you're doing a solid fill, often you see that if it's like filling this area, it does just a random like grid and then it goes and does another grid and then it starts laying down your solid fill. That random grid is your undersewing. And I always like to turn it on because it supports your stitches and it lifts the stitches so that you have more of a fill. So we're going to turn the undersewing on. So now, and on the Solaris, it takes a minute. When those blue dots are scrambling, that says that it's making the adjustment. Just be patient and wait. So now we have digitized all of our solid fills. Now on a on a Solaris, it shows you that it's changed it. On a Destiny, Meridian, and Altair, you're just going to have to be patient and you're going to have to wait until you get to embroidery to see what it looks like. Okay, so now we've done this. Okay, so we need to digitize something else. So we're going to use the select arrows. These move us between different parts. So you can see when I touch the select key, it's highlighting this whole thing, which is my fill. Okay, so now I want to digitize my fill. So everything comes in at 100%. So this is a huge it's just a huge advantage on these machines that you can switch this. So what happens is something is at 100%, it means that each of those circles are going to be about 1 inch large. this is a pretty small design. We don't want to have just 1 or 2 circles in there. We want to have lots of circles. So if I go to the 100%, I can move anywhere between 50% and 200%. So if I press and hold, it'll stop when it gets to 50%. I know this is a small area. I'm just going to make it at 50%. And it changed it. You can see how small they are in here. Now, if that's too small for you, we could do 65%, 70, 75%. You're the designer, so let's try 75%. Again, on a Solaris, I can see this. On the other machines, you can't. Okay, this is the angle at which they come in. So you can see that my circles are straight up and down. I can change this in 15-degree increments. So let's say I change these to 60 degrees. Watch what happens. So now instead of the circles being straight up and down, they're going at an angle. Okay? So I'm going to leave it there. Now, if you're on a Destiny, Meridian, or Pathfinder, you have these two, and you also have the option of off or on. And what the off and on is, it's the border out here. And we want to leave the border to off. On most of the machines, the default is on. So if it's on, I want you to turn it to off. And what it does is, we don't want this to create, we're working on our circles, our fill. We don't want this to create a border around here because we want to add a different border. So let me just turn this on since I'm on a Solaris, and I'll show you what it does. It's put a border here. We don't need that border because we're going to create our own border. So I want to leave that off. Okay, if you're on a Solaris, again, it's awesome because you have something that's called random shift. So if I touch this, I can random shift these multiple times. So I'm going to go to 6 and watch what happens. It changes my circles from circles to little pebbles. Do you see how they're all kind of messed up in there? And this is offset. So what offset does is it moves it, and on circles it's not going to matter, but if you had a floral design, the floral design would come in the center, but if I do a position offset, instead of having the flower here, it would move the flower left or right, or up or down. And then the final thing that is on this Solaris is everything comes in thick, so it's multiple layers of thread. I can choose the thickness to be thinner, and now I won't have multiple layers. I will just have a single passive thread. Now, I don't like this. I'm going to go back. I'm going to leave it at 75%, but I want to turn my skewed, my random shift, I want to put it back to 0 because I want my circles to be straight up and down. So there they are. I'm going to leave them at a 60-degree angle, but I'm going to have them, and I want to make them smaller. So again, on a Solaris, when you're playing, you can see the change right away on your screen. But if you're on a Destiny, Pathfinder, or Meridian, you will not be, I'm sorry, I keep saying Pathfinder, Destiny, Aerial, or Meridian, you won't be able to see the change right here. Okay, so now I've digitized that. I'm happy with it. So I'm going to scroll over, and the next thing that comes up is the red fill, but we've already done that. So I'm going to bypass it. The next one is the green. You can see it's got the changes on it. And there's 4 leaves, so I'm going to have to scroll through 4 times. Okay, and I'm looking for my solid stitch here. And I don't see that. Okay, I can still fix it. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to hit return. I'm going to go to my line properties. I'm going to choose a color. So I'm going to choose my bean stitch and a color. I thought I chose that before, but apparently I didn't. And I'm going to touch this to make this be a bean stitch. Okay, so I'm going to go through one more time. There's my solid fill, it's digitized. There's my filler, digitized. The red, there's 4 greens. And then here is that blue line. I want to go ahead and stitch that out right now too. And this is my stitch length, which is 0.08 inches, and that's good to have. Usually I would make the stitch length longer, but this is such a small area, I'm just going to keep it at that. Okay, so now when I hit set, it's going to give you the message. What we're doing is we're leaving IQ Designer. Remember, I told you we're working in artwork. It's not stitches yet. If I don't save it, what happens is I'm going to have to go back and recreate the whole thing. But we've saved enough. I'm good with it. So once I go to embroidery, I can't go back to IQ Designer and make changes. But it's okay. We've checked everything. So I'm going to touch OK, and just this quick, it turns it into stitches. So right now, this is what I have so far. I have an ornament. It's about 8 1/4 by 3 inches. I'm okay with that. And it's showing you what we've digitized so far. Okay, now I need to go back and I need to add the outline here, and my topper. So I'm going to go to add. Now remember, we don't move anything on the screen, and you're going to see how everything just lines up beautifully. So I'm going to go back to add. I want to go to my IQ Designer, and I want to pull from memory. So if you're on a Destiny or a Meridian or Altair, you're going to pull the arrow. It's down here. It's the arrow coming out. And if you're on a Solaris, you're going to come here and pull it out from your machine. I'm going to pull it off of my stick. And the one that we want to pull out is the one that has the topper on it. So yours might look like the tube, or it might look like this, but we're going to touch OK and bring it onto the screen. Okay, all I want is this portion here to be a candle wicking stitch, and I want this portion to be a running stitch or a bean stitch. The problem is, if I assign a line property now, all these lines are connected, so they're going to have the same property. So let me show you. If I go here and choose the bean stitch and choose red and touch OK and touch my beaker and come over here, everything turns red because they're connected. So I'm going to undo that, and what we're going to do is this part lays under this part. So what I'm going to do is erase the top part of this. I'm just going to do this line here only. So I'm going to come in, grab my eraser, and I am going to erase this whole thing here. So again, I can zoom in. And again, you may have a red box up here that you can zoom around on, but what I want to get rid of is this piece. So I'm going to touch my eraser, and I like a square, and I'm going to come down like this just to the top. And if you go too far, this is why I like to erase, let go, erase, let go. Okay, and I'm going to zoom in more. And again, on a Solaris, you can zoom into 1600%. Look how large my eraser is getting, but I'm okay with that. And I want to erase one more little point. And it's okay if you erase just one more little pixel, but don't erase too much, because I know I'm going to make this a candle wicking stitch, and a candle wicking stitch takes up a little room. Okay, so I've erased that, and I'm going to zoom out. Now, I want this to be a candle wicking stitch, so I'm going to go to my line properties. I'm going to choose the candle wicking stitch, a color, touch OK, touch my beaker, and touch this. Now remember, we don't want this to sew. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my line properties, touch no sew, touch OK. My beaker's highlighted. I'm going to touch this. Now that's not going to sew. I'm going to touch next. It brings up my candle wicking stitch. Okay. This is the size of your candle wicking stitch. And again, someday you can play. I'm going to make this a little smaller. I'm just going to randomly pick a number. So I'm going to make it 0.12. I'm just going to have a nice tight little candle wicking stitch there. And then this is the space. and I'm going to leave just a little bit of space there. So I'm okay with that. Now I'm going to take this to embroidery. So I'm going to hit, that's the only thing that I have to digitize. I can't select because there's only one thing on the screen. So I hit set OK, preview OK, whatever's down here, you're going to hit it. On this machine, I'll hit it twice. On the other machines, you're going to depress it 4 times. So when I hit it twice, you can see that it lined it up just perfectly on there. Okay, and now we have to add the outline here and our little topper. So I'm going to hit add one more time. I'm going to go back to IQ Designer one more time. I'm going to pull out of memory. If you're on a Destiny or those machines, you're going to touch the arrow coming out. On my Solaris, I'm going to touch up here. I'm going to pull it out. You'll pull it out of your machine. I'm pulling it from my USB stick. Okay. And this time I'm going to have you pull the finished product, one of those that has the topper on it. So I'm going to select it and hit OK. Okay. Now I only want to digitize the border here and this guy. So what I need to do is get rid of all this stuff on the bottom. The whole thing is highlighted right now. I could take my eraser and just grab my eraser and go to town. I could just start erasing everything, okay? Or I could go and use my select tool. So on the Destiny and those, your select tool's here. On your Solaris, it's down here. So I can choose this and use this square, and what I can do is I can just select a portion of this. When I select that, these tools come to life and I can just hit cut and I get rid of that. So again, you can get rid of large portions by touching this and highlighting it, or you can use your eraser. So I'm just going to go ahead and erase this box because we're really done with it. So I'm going to erase my box. I'm going to make this bigger. I'm going to come over here, erase my box. And remember, if you leave one little portion up here, that's going to be a satin stitch and you're not going to be happy. So you need to make sure that you zoom in and get rid of all this stuff. I'm going to zoom in more. Got to find out where it's at. And as you zoom in, you gotta figure out where I want to get rid of this part of my line. So I'm taking my square. Again, just touch and let go, touch and let go. And I'm going to move over here, touch my eraser. I'm going to get rid of this, and to come from this side, I'm going to go over here and just, perfect. Okay, I'm going to go back to 100%. So the only thing that I haven't digitized now is this portion. Oops. So I'm going to go to my line properties. I'm going to touch, I want both of those to be a bean stitch. So I'm going to touch my bean stitch. I'm going to touch gray, touch OK. Now my pencil's highlighted. I'm going to touch my paint can, and when I touch this it turns gray, but notice these weren't touching before, so I have to touch both of them. I'm going to touch next, and when I touch next, you see a satin stitch comes up. I should not have a satin stitch. So you see this little red dot here? It's showing that I didn't erase something. So I'm going to zoom in so I can show you, because this is what happens to all of you in class. There's a little stitch that I didn't erase floating out here in left field. So I'm going to hit return, and I'm going to grab my eraser, and I'm going to go up here and erase that. And I know it's gone when I hit OK and I hit next. If your satin stitch comes up, it's the first thing that comes up. It means that you haven't erased something out here. Okay, so I have this and this are both going to be bean stitches. I want them to have the same properties. I'm just going to link them, and I'm going to leave this at 0.08, and I'm just going to stick them, excuse me, and I'm going to take it to embroidery, and there it is. Okay, so This is ready to go to embroidery. So if I touch embroidery, it's all linked together, and I'm going to put it in memory just so I don't lose anything. And you're going to save it on your machine. I'm going to save it here. Okay. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about in class, if I hit the return key, everything is separate. So now everything is in pieces and parts. When I hit embroidery, it's all linked together. But if I go back to where it's separated, one of the things you can do is see how something stitches out before you ever stitch it out, just to make sure you have it in the right order. So if I go up here, now remember, I have not touched embroidery because embroidery shows. If the word memory shows, you've got to hit return. But when I can see the word embroidery, I go up here and I touch my hoop. And my hoop actually has a stitch out key. So if I touch the stitch out, I can play it slow, medium, or fast. But if I touch my play key, watch what happens. This is exactly how it's going to stitch out. And I'm going to speed it up. So you can see it's going to do the gray fill, that fill, and I can speed it up even more. Okay, and as I got all finished, I noticed that I did not do an outline on here, on my red flower. So that's the beauty of stitching something out. I can see that I forgot my outer flower here. So I'm going to go back to Add. I'm going to go back to IQ. I'm going to pull it out of memory. You know where it's at now. I'm going to pull out this one. And all I want to do is, I forgot to tell it to do a stitch around here. No problem. I'm just going to go to my line properties. I'm going to choose the candle wicking stitch because that's what I want. I'm going to choose red, touch OK, touch my beaker, and touch my red flower. Now, I've told it I want it to be a candle wicking stitch, and that's all I need to do right now, and I'm okay with the order of things, but I don't want it sewing any of this. So I could go and say, I'm going to erase all of that, but let's make it easy. Let's go to our line properties. Let's touch no sew, touch OK. My beaker's touched. I don't want to sew that. This is separate. I don't want to sew it. I don't want to sew that. And I don't want to sew that. Now everything is grayed out except for this. And when I touch next, the only thing that should show is my candle wicking stitch. And I want to make this candle wicking stitch really small. So let's do a 0.12. And I could do spacing, but I'm going to leave the spacing the same as it is. If I take it all the way to embroidery, so I'm either going to touch this key 4 times or 2 times. And you can see that it puts a candle wicking stitch around it. So I'm going to touch embroidery, and I'm going to save it to my memory. And we are ready to go. So this one is now ready to stitch out. Okay, before I get ready to stitch this out, when we started class, we said that all of our blocks, we were going to quilt as we did embroidery. Okay, so I want to quilt behind this. I'm going to hit return, okay, because my add stuff, add my background in embroidery is under my edit key. When I touch embroidery, it's not under layout, it is under edit. So if I touch my edit key, I have the option of adding stippling or echo quilting behind here. But what happens is if I touch this key and I go to add my stippling, it adds behind the last thing, which was this part. So what we need to do is we need to group everything, because you can see here's the red box, and what it wants to do is it's stitching behind this red box. We want it to stitch behind everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my grouping key, and if I go to my grouping key, I'm going to group everything together. And when it turns everything to red, that's showing that it is grouped together. So I'm going to touch OK. And now when I add my stippling, it stitches it behind everything. So I could add stippling, or I could add echo quilting. Okay. And if I added echo quilting, I could decide how far I wanted from the original shape and how far apart I want it. So if I touch this, I can take that ripple effect out pretty far. So I can change how far apart those ripples are. Now, I could go ahead and go to embroidery and I could stitch this out, but I'm stitching this out in a hoop that's 10.5 by 16. That's okay, but when I go to cut it and I'm cutting it to 4 by 10, I'm going to cut all of these threads. So you could stitch it out like this, be perfectly fine, trim it, sew it together, no one's going to know, okay? But what I like to do is I like to end up with something that is pretty much the size that I want it to be. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it a different way. So I'm going to start over to show you how we can do it in the perfect size that we're going to need for our finished project. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit home, clear it, and we're going to start from scratch. Okay. So one way that we can get it so that it's the perfect size that we need it when we're finished is to go to embroidery, and we're going to take it out of memory in embroidery. And when you pull it up, make sure you pull up the one. So I'm going to set it, and I just want to zoom in to make sure that it's the one that has the little candle wicking stitches around here, and it does. So I'm going to zoom back out. Okay, so instead of just adding it behind here, we're actually going to go back to a box in IQ Designer. So what we want to do is we want to connect everything. So we're going to go to, so this is the box that we're touching that groups. I'm going to touch it, and I'm going to group everything because we want to make the outside of this shape so that this quilting that we add goes around the whole thing. So I'm going to touch OK, and it is grouped. You can see that everything's grouped. So now I'm going to touch Edit, and I'm going to take this to IQ Designer. So I'm going to touch this, the flower, and it says we're going to put your quilting right up next to this. What do you want me to do? You have two choices. Cancel. That gets us nowhere. So we're going to put it in memory. So we touch memory, and it says you're going to recall this from IQ Designer and the stamp pattern. So I'm going to touch OK. So then it says, what do I want to do? Well, I want to go to IQ Designer. How do I get there? I touch Add. I'm going to go to IQ Designer. I'm going to recall it from my stamps, and this is the flower that you saved it in. That's where you saved it under Edit. So I'm going to touch it, and there it is. So I'm going to touch it and touch OK. Now you notice it brings out just, the only thing that comes in here is just this outline shape, which is good, okay, but I'm going to put it, I want to make sure we're in the center, and we are. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that box. So this is going to finish. We're going to trim it at 4.5 by 11. So I'm just going to go ahead and make my 4.5 by 11 inch box. So I'm going to go to Shape Creator. I'm going to touch that box. I'm going to touch OK. And I'm going to size it to 4.5 by 11. So it comes in with the red box around this box. We're going to stretch it to now I need to make this go bigger, so I'm going to use this to go to 11, So we want the top number. You can see the top number is the height. So I want the top number to be 11. And I want the width to be 4.5. Okay, so this is the finished size. Okay, and I'm going to touch OK. I'm going to let you see what we have here. Here's the outside of my ornament. Here is the finished size of my block. Okay, now I don't want it to sew this. So I'm going to go to my line properties, touch no sew, touch OK, select my beaker. It's already not going to sew this. You can hear it clicking. I don't want it to sew this, but now I want to put a fill in here. So I'm going to go to fill properties. I don't want a solid fill. I want something exciting. So I'm going to go to my new fills, touch select, and you can choose whatever you like. I'm going to choose the cross hatching, touch OK. I've got a color selected, touch OK. I'm in my fill properties. I don't want to paint the fill on. I want to pour the fill on. And I'm going to touch the area that I want to fill. I want to fill outside my ornament, but inside the finished. And voila, there it is. Okay, when I go to next, I only have one thing that I'm going to digitize. It comes in at 100%. It's fine, that's about an inch. You can adjust the size any way you want. So we could do the size, we could do the angle. We've already turned the outside border off. If yours is on, turn it to off. This was our random shift. This was our offset, and we can either make the quilting heavy or light if you're on a Solaris. I'm going to make mine light. On the other machine, you have to keep it as heavy. There it is. I'm going to touch set, OK, and you can see it came right into embroidery, and it is embroidered right around this. So I'm going to put my whole thing in memory once again, just so I have it and I won't lose it. Now, after you stitch this whole thing out, and again, it's going to stitch it out, the very last thing is going to be your border. This might be a little bit smaller, and you can see that instead of 4.5, it's 4.47 by 10.96. So when you go to cut it at 4.5 by 11, but now you're not going to be cutting those threads. The reason why it came in a little bit is because if we had added the outside border, it would have made it exactly the 4.5 by 11. But just make sure after you stitch this that you measure and cut it 4.5 by 11, and then it will fit in your table runner beautifully. So this one, although it took a little while, it's just a beautiful block, and you can see how you can use the built-in shapes to create your own things. So now you're ready to stitch this one.